All right, it's time to talk off-season NBA basketball. I'm Jose Salviati, editor at thepeachbasket.net. He's Steve Purciello, a longtime educator, vice principal, and athletic director, as well as a high school coach. I needed to add that because I think it's important. And this is the 13 Rules Random NBA Thoughts Overtime podcast. This is a show where we're going to discuss NBA stars from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. These are players that you've probably heard about, but never got to see play. I really don't know a lot about them. That's what's exciting, right? What made these guys special? What player today most resembles that player? And what is Steve's greatest memory about that player? Because Steve might have very well have seen those players live, which is pretty envious. Today we're going to discuss, I think the right way to say that is I'm pretty envious. Today we'll discuss Hall of Famer, 5-time NBA All-Star, 2-time All-NBA first-team player, 1977 NBA scoring champ, whose numbers are retired with 3 different franchises, the Hawks, the Jazz, and the Pelicans. Owner of one of the coolest nicknames in NBA history. We don't do cool nicknames anymore. We're talking about Pistol Pete Maravich. So
First
really,
of all, I just want to change something. Four times his number was retired. LSU retired it also.
That's fair. That's fair. I did. Yeah. And I should have clarified that. You're absolutely right. Yeah, that's a special honor. This guy was special. He was unique. I think he was ahead of his time. I'm kind of excited to talk about this because I got to see the end of Pistol Pete's career. I remember he kind of rode the bench with the Celtics, the Larry Bird Celtics. So I got to see a little bit, and even then, you got to see some flashes, right, of who he was. But I didn't get to see prime Pistol Pete. So definitely very excited to talk about him. Let's start like we have with what made him special. Why is it decades after he played that we're still talking about Pistol Pete Maravich? What made him unique?
Well, let's start with college. He was the all-time, right now, he's the men's all-time leading scorer, 3,000 something points. In college, they didn't have a three-point shot then. There was no shot clock. I mean, if there were a lot of things that, also as a freshman couldn't play varsity basketball then. So he did it in 3 years. Caitlin Clark is now the all-time scorer. She just passed him. But this guy scored over 3,000 points in 3 years. And it was ironic. He was a one-man show. His team in college was really not a good team. I happened to see them in the NIT in 1970. And it was him with a bunch of guys playing basketball. But he had, his father was the coach, Press Maravich, and he had free wheel. And people forget, not only was he a great shooter, three-point shot, he was a tremendous ball handler who was one of the first people to throw the ball behind his back or over his shoulder or do all those things that in that time was considered being the hot dog.
I was going to say, didn't I get him benched?
Not by his father. His father's not making him out. So he's fun. If you ever get a chance, there's a movie on Maravich, and one of the scenes in it is they show dad driving the car, and Maravich's hand is out the door, and he's dribbling the basketball as the car's moving. That was one of the things his father's drill, did with him.
Right.
The movie. And Maravich, I believe in, his memoir came out, not his memoir, his biography came out 10 years ago. And I think they mentioned all that also about how the dad really drilled him and his father drove him to be the player, that he was.
Pete's dad, one of those dads that drives you a little too hard, right? We had the football player here in Oakland whose name sounded a lot like Maravich. I can't remember his name. Maravich. Yeah. Right. Was that the same kind of overbearing dad? Because I'd never heard that story before.
Dad was a coach. Dad was his coach. Dad, I know, he was an overbearing father. He pushed him beyond belief. And Maravich was like, he was wrapped tight, meaning, with things. So yeah, that probably did stem from his dad. But he was just way ahead of his time, I guess is the best way to put it. This is just college. Now, coming out of college, don't forget, in this time, there were a lot of people who didn't like him because they thought he was a hot dog and a one-man player and all. In college, they lost in the NITs. That's one of my first memories of him in the semifinals to Marquette, who won the tournament. But then he came out and he went and he was drafted by the Atlanta Hawks, number 3 in the 70 draft, which is ironic because you would think a guy that great would be the first pick. What and 2 other people, one Bob Lanier, who was great in college, came before him at St. Bonaventure, but the other guy is a very interesting person, Rudy Tomjanovich, who never had that kind of career, but he came
Yes.
second, and then Maravich was taken by the Hawks third. Maravich played for the Hawks for 4 years, I believe, and in those 4 years, he scored 25 or so, or give or take, but the Hawks never took off. They never got better. So now we get to 75, and the New Orleans Jazz are a new 74, 75 with a new basketball team in the NBA. Now, what better to draw people would be to get the LSU star who's having a rough time with the Hawks. So they traded and got him. Now, with the and I was fortunate enough when we were at the Mardi Gras, I guess 76 or 77, and they played in the Superdome then. And we saw a game with Pete Maravich in the Superdome.
No
Uh,
way.
yeah, yeah, this was many, many years ago, but I recall that we were sitting real near the floor because the New Orleans Jazz didn't draw. So we were sitting near the floor, and it's just amazing to watch him. He was just he was a show. And they also had a guy by the name of Truck Robinson, who was a pretty good player playing with them. But I remember that clearly.
Didn't Danny Ainge bite him?
Who no, that was Tree Rollins.
Oh,
Oh,
sorry.
Truck Robinson was a little before Danny Ainge. But anyway, New Orleans, and then he played there for a couple of years when the franchise decided they couldn't make it, they moved to Utah. Uh,
Right.
but and he went there for a year or so, and his knees began to go. And at that point, I believe they waived him. When he got waived, the Celtics picked him up, and this was in Bird's first year, 1980. And he played. Bill Fitch was the coach. Bill Fitch and him didn't love each other.
Mm,
And next year, and Maravich had knee problems, so he was only going to be a spot player. But in 81, in the preseason, Maravich retired. Now, the story was he couldn't play his legs and everything else, but there was always that thing out there that he and Bill Fitch didn't like each other,
mm.
and you didn't want to play for him because Bird loved him. Bird thought he was way ahead of his time and all that other, all those other great things. But that was the end of the career. I have a lot of memories about Maravich when he was in his career. I can go back, and as I just mentioned, we saw him in the Superdome. I remember that game. But the big one, the couple of things I remember in 1970, I lived outside of New York in New Jersey, and we went to Madison Square Garden because the NIT, all the games in the NIT back then were in the Garden.
Mm.
So teams came to the Garden and played. Now, before we get there, his senior year, they were 22 and 10. 22 and 10 today would be NCAA tournament team. They were
Sure.
second in the SEC. Back then, there were only 24 teams making the NCAA. Now, what is it, 48 or something? It's
Yeah.
64. It's 64 now. So it's a little different. But we saw him play. We were in the Garden. But back then, I don't remember. It wasn't sold out. But Maravich did draw a good crowd. We were able to run down as they came out for warm-ups, and Maravich's warm-ups were a thing that everybody talked about. Here's this kid with like I guess a long hair down above his ears, to his ears, below his ears, and straight long hair, floppy. It's flopping all over. He's got these white socks he wore. They were like the old woolen socks. There he is, right there in the picture. The old woolen socks, and they were floppy. Now it's a little different there. That's in the NBA, I believe. But in college, he wore the white socks and he was shooting layups and he was doing all kinds of things. It was just his warm up show was well known. Like everybody wanted to see it. I remember we're on the baseline, in the Garden, and we were looking out on it maybe 40 feet away. And I was like, oh my God. And I was with one of my friends and we were both like, oh, this guy is just incredible. Should have
Wow.
passing there and the things he can do. And boy, he can shoot. But he was good. So that was my first memory. Now, about 6 years later, we did see him with in the before that, we saw him play. I saw him in New Orleans, but then I remember in Jersey, again, living in Jersey, we had a Channel 9, which had the Knick games. And I remember Walt Frazier, who I liked, was a great player, guarding him in a game. This got to be in the winter, in January, February, watching the game on TV. Maravich went for 68 and just annihilated Walt Frazier. And don't
Wow.
forget, again, I'm going to keep saying it, no 3-point shot.
Yeah.
So it's incredible. And as you can see with the film, look at him between the legs passes. That was unheard of back then. He just
Right.
incredible player. I can't even like explain how good he was and how he shielded the passing again. It just he was way ahead of his time, a player ahead of his time.
So, and let me dig into that a little bit because we hear that a lot, but I think that's man.
Yeah.
Was he the first guy to do these kinds of things? 'Cause today you see guys in the G League. You see every now and again you see someone try
Well,
behind the back, nutmeg, whatever. But was he the first guy to really do this?
well, he was way ahead. Cousy was the first guy to go behind his back, but he was
Right.
way ahead of everybody else. Just the things he did with the passes over the shoulder, not looking, there's an example, the no
Yeah.
look stuff and all the
Yeah.
other things that just made players better on his team. Again, I'll go back to that college team. The team was terrible. They had one player, and he carried them to the semifinals. And unfortunately, at that time, they couldn't get into the NCAAs. But so just the career and what he can do with a basketball is incredible. It just there's nobody probably in our history that was as talented as him.
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit. 44.2 points per game on average in college without a three-point line. That's staggering. Like, how do you do that? I mean, that's absolutely unbelievable. Was he, you started off by saying, he went third. This is a guy who averaged 44.2 and he went third because people thought he was a little bit of a ball hog, right? So I mean, he the way he passed, the way he handled it, I don't understand why people felt that way about him. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm looking at
But
a complete player.
basketball was completely different in that time. It
Yeah.
was more coach control. And by coach controlled, I mean there were set plays where there weren't a lot of options. You ran the play through. Now, if you watch, it's a lot of read and react the offenses, but also there were options and there were options off of things. There weren't as many. Again, the UB Browns were becoming coaches, and he was a coach with the Kentucky Colonels in the 70s. But those guys believed in really calling a play every time down the court, and
Yeah.
in other words, taking away that individuality
Right.
from the player.
Right.
Basketball was a completely different game. If you played like Maravich or tried to, people would in the stands would call you a hot dog or just, give you a hard time because that was not accepted. So it really it's something you have to understand. Basketball, the way it's played today, was not the way it's always been played, I guess, or coached.
Yeah. No, I get that. Wow. Well, we talked about what made him special. You certainly brought up your favorite memory. I assume actually watching him play live, which is pretty spectacular. What we haven't touched on, and I know oftentimes this isn't a fair question to ask. We hate when we do it to new players, right? When a player is drafted and they say, "Oh, that's the next Michael, that's the next Magic, that's the next whatever." But we're kind of doing this in reverse. Who is today's Pistol Pete Maravich, right? Who
That's
most resembles his style of play?
That's a difficult thing. I'll use with the ball in his hands, Nate Archibald when he started out with Cincinnati, and that's going back. And his first coach was Bob Cousy, by the way, but he was like that. He led the league in points, assists. I mean, he just, and he was a walking double double every night before double doubles were even talked about. But
Yes.
he was with the ball. But I don't think he was nearly as good a pure shooter as Maravich. Maravich can hit from anywhere, long range, anywhere. And I don't think, Archibald doesn't fill that part. In that time, Jerry West was a similar type shooter to him, where incredible range and incredible ability to shoot. And I always who played with the Hawks, he was a great shooter, that kind of player. But we're not getting, I'm not comparing with anybody today, I guess. be
Yeah.
the way to best describe it.
Ironically, because I really want to put a name to somebody who's playing today, and the first guy who came to mind, again, ironically, is an Atlanta Hawk, and that's Trey Young. In terms of his ability to shoot from anywhere, score, does not have the handle, does not have I think the charisma or the ability. I mean, I've seen Trey make some nice passes before. I mean, does that bother you? Do you think Trey
No,
Young is maybe
it wasn't
50,
as good, but here's the thing about that, and it's very similar. Trey Young takes a beating in Atlanta because they don't win.
Yeah,
When Maravich played in Atlanta, he took a lot of heat, and
yeah,
that's why they ultimately traded him because they didn't win. And that I think is significant as a comparison. Trey Young, he could play. I don't think he's near as good, and that's not a put down on Trey Young, a ball
mhm,
handler as Maravich.
yeah,
Maravich,
right.
there's no like it's hard to explain how good a passer you showed it in the tape, but it's very difficult to explain. Now you take all that and make it a great shooter as well, and you realize how good he was. I mean, and I guess he played 10 years in the NBA. If in today's world he would have played 13 years because he would have played his freshman year in college, and then he would play 3 more years.
Right,
So,
right.
his numbers would have gone up. Hall of Famer, All NBA a number of times. I mean, it would have been even better
Yeah.
than what it was, though 44 points a game in college, that'll never be
No,
surpassed.
no, I don't see how. He was unique, and we throw around the term ahead of his time a lot, I think, but this is the player who it undeniably applies for, and this is the kind of guy that I think, and I don't know that it's true of every player we'll talk about, but I think this is a guy who, in his prime, could be an impactful player in today's NBA. Do you think?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I think the biggest argument would be, could he be part of a winning team?
Yeah.
That would be the biggest argument you might make about him because it didn't happen. Again, that was when not Boston, but other teams like the Knicks and the Lakers were in their day and all that. So it was more difficult, but it still was, it didn't equate to winning.
Yeah. I'm looking at his career now, and yeah, his teams were not good.
And I believe the Hawk teams, when he got drafted, they were pretty good. And I know if I remember correctly, but I believe there was a little resentment from the veteran players towards him. I believe they
Mhm.
had Joe
Makes sense.
Caldwell and Zelmo Beatty and I think Bridges, and I'm going off the top of my head. Those three, Hudson might have been, I think he was with them. And those old time players didn't quite like Maravich, and that didn't help the situation. And then his first coach was Richie Guerin. Richie Guerin was a tough basketball player, played for the Knicks and the Hawks and all. But Eh, I don't know if they meshed real well. And again, that's just conjecture. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. See, but that's the thing. It's not about getting drafted. It's about getting drafted to the right team too. I think that's so important. He played 9 seasons with Atlanta and the Jazz, and he made it to the playoffs 3 times. That's just that's not going to cut it. Which it's unfortunate. I think if he was in a better place, I think we'd be talking. I mean, he obviously terrific career, top 75, top 50 NBA player, but he didn't come close to winning it all.
But I guess the biggest point in this, not the biggest, one of the bigger points would be in that time, the game and the teams were coach dominated. Today, it's player dominated. And
That's
that
true.
is a very important thing to understand. Coaches, people believe that the coaches can make a team win and so on. What we found out is get the most talent and you win.
Yeah.
Or you're right there, I guess.
Yeah. That reminds me, and we'll finish on this note. Phil Jackson lost to Michael Jordan for 3 seasons or 2 seasons. And then he comes back and they put a mic in his face and they said, "So what do you expect?" And Phil Jackson, straight face, says, "Well, I guess we're going to score a few more points now."
Well, he's right. He's right. Well, you know what? As great as coach as Jackson was, when Jordan was gone for a year and a half, he came back for the second year. But those 2 years, they didn't win it.
They didn't win.
Yeah,
Houston.
and and then he had a tough time the last year with one of those years with the Lakers with Malone and all. They didn't
Yep.
do well either. So, it does come back to the talent.
And this is the great circle of life, right? Who was the number one pick in Marinovich's draft? Rudy Tomjanovich. Who was the coach of those Houston Rockets? Rudy
Yep.
Tomjanovich.
Yeah. Well, he
Circle of
wasn't the
life.
number one pick. He was the number two pick.
Oh, number two.
Bob Lanier was the first pick.
Got
And
it.
Lanier was great. He was,
You ruined my story. Why would
well,
you do that? It's a great
that's what,
story.
it's one of the things I try to do every week. I did it again. You know,
Forget facts. I just needed a good. I needed a good story.
can't let it happen. My memories are too good.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I appreciate that. All right, man. That's it. What a great time talking about Pistol Pete Maravich. This is a guy who we didn't. I was going to sign us off right now, but I got to say, coolest nickname. One of the coolest nicknames in the history of the NBA. Pistol Pete is a nickname that I think it resonates. I think it's great. He's a shooter, right? I mean, I don't think it could fit today, right? They changed the Bullets to the Wizards. Nobody's going to come out and
True.
call him Pistol Pete anymore. But one of the coolest nicknames in the history of the NBA, bar none, Pistol Pete Maravich, guy ahead of his time. Let us know if you want us to discuss any particular player that you've heard of, maybe you never got to see. If Steve got to see him or heard about him, we'd love to talk about your favorite player from the 60s, 70s, or 80s. But until we hear from you, we're going to keep picking. And next week, please join us on 13 Rules Overtime when we discuss I forget, man.
I believe the
Bill
Bill
Walton.
Bill Russell, Bill Walton.
Oh, Bill Russell. That's what I
Yeah.
wrote. Bill Russell, the
Yeah.
11-time champion.
Yeah.
Let's
And
go.
probably one of the greatest all around, meaning not just a player, just in life with what he did with
Yeah,
with race and everything else.
there you go. Player, coach, yeah, 11 rings. That's the mic drop right there. All right. I got to just read what I wrote because I wrote Bill Russell and for some reason I had a brain fart. What the
Hell,
hell?
when you get to be my age, you do it all the time. So don't worry.
Well, on that note, we're going to sign off. Thanks so much for listening. We hope you find us next week when we talk again about the great Bill Russell. We'll talk then, Steve. Thank you.
Take care.